And we're back in my basement dungeon gym, like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your early Thursday evening here with me in New York. But once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. So I figure do a little cardio, and the ideas seem to kind of fester and then germinate and take root. When my heart rate is elevated, ideas just flow. So I wasn't really feeling like recording anything, and then all of a sudden I start moving, I start breathing air, give these people air, and then all of a sudden I got all kinds of ideas. So a couple of days ago was a horror movie anniversary in honor of it being spooky season, the 31st anniversary of the release of a film that's a classic that I don't really like, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Well, today is the 33rd, that was the 31st anniversary. This is the 33rd anniversary of a horror classic that I do like, that I have in my top 5 all-time greatest horror films, or favorite. You can use those words interchangeably, but I would argue that this is not just a favorite film, this is a phenomenal horror film. Released on this day, October 16, 1992, is Bernard Rose's amazing adaptation of a not that exciting short story from the otherwise spectacular Clive Barker, the British Stephen King. It's what he was known as, it still is. And Clive Barker was also a filmmaker and had a number of his projects, Nightbreed, Lord of Illusions, turned into movies. But Bernard Rose's adaptation of the forbidden Candyman. And I did not see Candyman in theaters, although I was already a horror movie fan. I guess you could say a little bit of a horror movie aficionado. I read a lot of books on horror, and the irony is that the professor at New York University, when I first got there in the fall of 1994, as Wes Craven's New Nightmare was opening, William K. Everson, a famous film historian, professor of New York University, and he was a frequent talk show guest. He appeared on the old Joe Franklin radio show a lot, talking movies. It was a little bit like in later era when Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert would make the talk show rounds, Letterman and Leno and Carson back in the day, even Arsenio Hall, to talk movies when it was, Oscar time. So William K. Everson wrote a number of books about the horror genre and different aspects of it, different types of films, different filmmakers, and even horror movies from different countries, like the Hammer horror movies with, Peter Cushing and Sir Christopher Lee, many of them directed by Freddie Francis, that kind of thing. So I had some level of understanding. I wasn't just an 18-year-old kid who enjoyed being scared. I felt like I had slightly more refined tastes, even though I didn't think that I was ever going to go to film school. When I graduated high school, I was lucky to graduate. I still don't understand how I got a high school diploma. How many classes are you allowed to fail and still get a diploma? Because it would seem that I failed more classes than more than half my classes I failed. So how did I get a diploma? I want to get to the bottom of this. No, actually I don't. I don't fucking care. It's a long time ago. Nobody is going to excavate my academic records to say, maybe we shouldn't have given this guy, well, tough shit, too late. Or in the immortal words of Christopher Reeve's Superman, too late, Luther, too late. But I didn't see Candyman in theaters. I had a vague idea that the film was a little bit different. It was promoted, the trailer was okay, but there was enough of a sense that this was just a garden variety slasher film. Maybe there was, say his name 5 times, a little bit of a twist, but the reviews in the local newspapers were not that great. Newsday gave it 2 stars. I don't know about the Post or the Daily News or the Times. I really wasn't as plugged into the Matrix until I got to film school. And then I would, if I had any interest in a film, when it was released, I not only would check out Newsday, which we got at home, but I would go to stores and I would actually look up or look in New York Post, New York Daily News, New York Times, USA Today to see the kind of consensus. And I did not do that for Candyman. So I didn't see it in theaters. The only movie kind of in the horror type realm that I saw in the latter part of '92, I saw Bram Stoker's Dracula. I don't like that movie. There's almost like this critical rebirth of, oh, well, it's actually a masterpiece. Listen, I love Francis Coppola. He's the godfather of new American cinema. That's the guy. George Lucas might be the most important single figure, but Francis Coppola, you know, like Tom Cruise, night and day. This is the guy. He's the guy. I'm the guy. I'm the guy. Coppola's the guy. I love The Rainmaker. I think Bram Stoker's Dracula, it looks good, but the film is not that great. And Keanu Reeves, what did they cast him for? He's horribly miscast. And there were a lot of jokes at the time pointing out, this is the least likely Jonathan Harker ever. We could just kind of go with it. You know, one critic even made a joke. He said, when he walks in the inside, you're just waiting for him to do Bill and Ted. Who's your interior decorator, dude? It doesn't work. And I love Gary Oldman. I love Anthony Hopkins. Winona Ryder is even good in that film, and that's not a role that I would have seen her in. It doesn't work. The only, like, suspense thriller horror film that I saw, which is not otherworldly, I saw a movie called Jennifer 8, which I feel like is a film that could be rediscovered by a new generation because it doesn't get that much play anymore, and I always thought it was underrated. The film was fantastic. I saw that in theaters at the Roosevelt Field Mall, where the following year I would watch In the Line of Fire on its opening day with my dear old dad. But Jennifer 8 is an interesting serial killer story, but it is presented as if it's a horror movie, even though it's taking place in a grounded real world. It has a lot of horror movie elements. It's a serial killer. You have Andy Garcia on the trail of a killer. You know, he has no witnesses, no clues, and no alibi, like one of those. But the supporting cast with John Malkovich and Kathy Baker and Lance Henriksen, and Uma Thurman plays the woman in danger. That film I thought was fantastic. So that's really the only suspense-type movie that I saw, because I don't even consider Bram Stoker's Dracula to be a horror movie. It was very campy, too. Now, I don't have anything against that, and I didn't have anything against that in '92. When I got to NYU, I understood that there is high camp where the entertainment value is elevated just because Judy Garland seems to be winking at the audience, or Greta Garbo is winking at the audience, and we get, you know, we can find humor in that. I didn't see that in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But when Candyman, by the time it was ready to come out on good old VHS, sometime in early 1993, it did okay at the box office, but you would have thought that it would have been a bigger hit than it actually was. So I rented the movie, and I was completely flabbergasted. Now, at that point in time, I wasn't familiar with Clive Barker. I knew who he was. I remember when Nightbreed was in theaters, and that's kind of a cult film. That was a very weird movie with some strange makeup effects and some really weird shit going on, parallel dimension type stuff. You know, Hellraiser was Clive Barker's idea. So Barker had a lot of films, books, short stories that had already been turned into movies, and it, you know, would continue to do so. But I don't think that I even knew that at that point that Candyman was based on a story by Clive Barker, and I just assumed that it was close. That okay, it's called The Forbidden. It must be, you know, the character must be Candyman, or I don't remember exactly the mechanics of it. But just going into the movie, taking it as a fresh piece of cinema, I couldn't believe how good it was. The film shocked me the whole way through. Because if you ask me, the mythology of Daniel Robitaille is way better than any villain origin. You really think that the Freddy Krueger thing is that interesting? Freddy Krueger, the character, is a scumbag from the first. He's a child killer, and then, spoiler alert, the parents corner him and kill him, and then he comes back. So it's not like, wow, what a wonderful guy this was who gets fucked over. Jason Voorhees, not that great. And yeah, the mom is the killer in the first movie. Spoiler alert again, as if you don't already know. If you're this far into this episode, you already know that. I don't think that's particularly interesting. Mike Myers is a fucking lunatic from the first. That guy needed to be under lock and key from when he was, I don't know, maybe a month old. I wouldn't want to be alone in a room with him when he was a month old. Just get him away from me. You know, security, or as my sister would say, no thank you, I'm all set here. Get him away. Is the origin story for Pinhead really that great? No. But this film has an origin story which it adds an element of tragedy and an element of there are extra layers without putting too fine a point on it. This film, the movie version of Barker's story, it gets into current realities in the early 1990s, and from a broader sense, it gets into realities in general. The way the world works, the way it worked then, and to some extent the way it works now. So yes, it's a horror movie, but it is a social commentary, a la John Carpenter's They Live, which is a science fiction film, and it's funny, Roddy Piper getting to do wrestling moves in the context of a movie, but that is a social commentary film. That is a movie saying, here's where we are as a society, and if we don't wake up, this is where we're going. You know, we were already in a dystopia. People were talking about dystopian shit in the 80s. You know, and everybody always thinks things, well, it's never been as bad as this. You know, in the 70s, this is the lowest point the country's ever had. And then there were people in the 80s, now we're even worse now. And in the 90s, everything is always worse because it's the way that our memories, we almost forget how miserable we were at another time. No, this is the worst. This is the worst. But what Candyman did by crafting this, the movie doesn't start, it has horror film elements, but we follow the Virginia Madsen character, the graduate student at, I guess it's supposed to be Northwestern, but they don't name it as Northwestern, I don't think. But she's researching urban folklore and urban legends. And this is something that when I finally, years later, read Clive Barker's short story, The Forbidden, I had even more respect, as if I need to have respect for a filmmaker who has a career, but I couldn't believe how much better the movie was than the short story. The short story is barely interesting. It has nothing to do with what we see in the film. First off, it's set in Liverpool. Not surprisingly, Clive Barker is British. It's set in Liverpool, and it's about this researcher who's looking more at like urban myths, but not like Candyman, and she's researching graffiti, and there's all kinds of stuff in this story that has nothing to do with what we saw in the film. So Bernard Rose came up with all of these amazing elements of backstory. There's no Daniel Robitaille. He made all that up. He took the outline of what Barker did in the broadest possible terms. Somebody doing research into. And then he said, well, what if we're researching some kind of urban mythology, urban folklore, and then how about if we transplant it to 1991 Chicago, and specifically this awful Cabrini Green housing project, where every day is a horror movie. It might not be a supernatural horror movie, but every day is a horror movie in its own way. So, the thing with Bernard Rose, now I was not familiar with his work, but there were certain critics that were looking forward to this movie based on the two films he had already made, and I did not know this at the time. I kind of picked up on it later. In 1988, he made a movie called Paper House, and it's an interesting film. It has elements of Nicolas Cage dream scenario from a couple of years ago, and it's about a girl who starts having dreams that are beginning to blur the line between the dream world and the real world. Not in a Matrix kind of way, but there are elements of, you could say there are elements of Paper House in the Matrix would be more accurate. But Roger Ebert, my favorite film critic, the Pulitzer Prize winner, I always talk about him, but he had Paper House in his top 10 best films of 1988. And that was a big year. You had Rain Man, you had Mississippi Burning, you had The Accidental Tourist. It was a solid year, a solid year for movies. Paper House, though, went in different directions. It did something different with its concept, and that's what Ebert and many critics, if you were to look it up, you'll see that the Rotten Tomato score is way up there. Difficult to even find negative reviews for Paper House. And then Bernard Rose's next film, he had a bigger budget, and he made a movie with, at the time, a rising young actress named Emily Lloyd. She worked with Peter Falk in a movie called Cookie. It's hard to guess when somebody comes on the scene because Emily Lloyd just showed up like a thunderbolt. She was in a bunch of movies, including the aforementioned Cookie. Her career really didn't go anywhere. I don't know why. I thought she was terrific and a very distinctive looking individual. But Bernard Rose made this movie called Chicago Joe and the Showgirl, which had elements of the musical, elements of the gangster film, and elements of the kind of doomed romance movie. And there were some critics that championed it. Oh my God, this is amazing. But it didn't really make any impression at the box office. I think it never got out of limited release. It was just, released in a few theaters here and there. But it showed that Bernard Rose was an outside-the-box kind of a filmmaker. So when he set out to make Candyman, yes, he was going to give us the gore. He was going to give us the kill sequences. But he saw Helen Lyle as the main character, not Candyman, who used to be this very, very successful artist who came from, he kind of was of good standing. I think that his family had money, or I don't remember the exact mechanics, but he wasn't just a random individual. It's Helen Lyle's story. And at the time, Virginia Madsen was not quite on the A-list, but this is a major Hollywood production, and she's playing the lead. And Bernard Rose, instead of just going for the instead of just going for the jugular from the jump, he takes the time to craft this as if it's a detective story. Because we see little bits and pieces of Candyman very early when Helen Lyle is beginning her research. But she doesn't think that any of this is real, and it's important to understand. She is a skeptic. She behaves like a normal person when presented with, well, this isn't true. There's no Candyman. This is make-believe. This is fairy tale fuckery. She doesn't really say that. But if people believe that it's real, and it takes hold, that if people's lives are altered because they're afraid of something and someone who doesn't exist, well, that's something maybe worthy of a Pulitzer Prize someday, or something along those lines. So the first 45 minutes of this movie, other than very early, the menacing voice of the late great Tony Todd as Candyman on the soundtrack, and we see this kind of memory moment of a kill sequence, but it develops like a detective story. She's trying to prove her point in the paper that she's going to write. And it's the fact that the film takes its time, that it doesn't race to get to all of the murders and what exactly is going on here. Is she making all of this up? Is this in her mind, or is there really this mythical creature wreaking havoc? So I was blown away by this movie, seeing it for the first time. Another ace in the hole. I don't know how Bernard Rose got Philip Glass to do the soundtrack. Now, Philip Glass, then as now, he's one of the 10 greatest living composers. I don't imagine too many people would take issue with that. There are so many fantastic composers. But Philip Glass's main theme, there's a couple of them, but the main themes are catchy, and you can listen to them again and again, and they really help to kind of sum up the movie, which is that it's, at its heart, they see it as a kind of doomed romance. And you ask yourself, which doomed romance? The doomed romance of Daniel Robitaille and the woman who resembles Helen Lyle in the 19th century, or the doomed romance, the thwarted romance, the pseudo-romance between Candyman and Helen Lyle. I don't know. We're just supposed to, draw those conclusions ourselves. So there were 2 official sequels that came out within a number of years of the original Candyman. Candyman Farewell to the Flesh does not bring back Virginia Madsen. And when I found out she was not in that movie, especially given how the first Candyman ends, dust, apologize. Given how the first Candyman ends, how could you make a sequel without her? That was the whole point. Whatever. I knew that the film was going to be terrible. So Tony Todd, comes to play, as they say, Veronica Cartwright. She's one of those people, she's either great or terrible, and it's usually not on, I shouldn't say that. It's not on her. It's usually how the character is written. She's fantastic in Alien, and she gives a great performance in The Witches of Eastwick, but her character is so horrendously unlikable that I started hating the actress. You're not supposed to do that, I understand. But Candyman Farewell to the Flesh is just not good, And then Candyman 3, Day of the Dead is even worse. Farewell to the Flesh is at least a reasonable horror film, but it doesn't take advantage. It does nothing with the concept, and that's why it fails. So, the Candyman reboot, which was promoted as a reboot, but it was actually a direct sequel, was supposed to come out summer 2020. So was Top Gun Maverick, and we all know that didn't happen in either case. So the Candyman reboot takes the mythology from the 1992 original and kind of continues the story decades later. And I thought that film, while not as good as the original Candyman, is certainly better than Candyman 2 and 3, and I was very impressed. But there is an idea that if you give audiences a lot to chew on, if they're interested, they're gonna inhale it. And Candyman gives the audience a lot of different things to ponder without beating you over the head. Because you can just watch this film for the jump scares, for the kind of gore, and for the crazy contortions of plot, which you for sure are not expecting. Most of the stuff in this movie, you're not thinking that any of this, and that's another reason why this is such a great film, is that there's no way when you start this movie, if you're a complete newbie, that you're not gonna guess any turns of plot, nothing other than that at some point, a character called Candyman, a vengeful spirit or something along those lines, is going to appear and start to wreak havoc. That's it. Everything else, you're not gonna have a clue. You're not gonna have any idea. And you don't have to get into the socioeconomic stuff. You don't have to focus on the social commentary that is at play here. This is just a great horror movie. It tells a fully realized, complete story, and it's so well acted. Virginia Madsen ended up being an Oscar nominee a dozen years later for Sideways, Alexander Payne's movie, and I thought that she was going to win because that movie was such a critical darling. And where was Paul Giamatti's Best Actor nomination? And while we're on that topic, where was his Best Actor nomination for American Splendor in 2003? I understand. I love Sean Penn. It's like my daughter in there. Mystic River with Clint. But where the fuck was Paul Giamatti's Best Actor nomination in 03 and 04? It's unbelievable. But Virginia Madsen is so good in this movie. She gives you the fact that Helen Lyle is not afraid. She is gutsy, and she is single-minded of purpose. And you could say this might be her undoing, which is the fact that she's not going to leave well enough alone. And she's not going to turn around simply because they try to scare her off, whoever the they is, and it just makes her mad. She's willing to go to the mat for this thesis, this paper, this doctoral that she's working on, and she's not going to be swayed. And she even points out, I don't scare easy. She doesn't scare at all. I mean, she stares down a bunch of gangbangers and it acts like, you guys get the fuck out of my way. It's like, there are multiple people who know I'm here. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, what they do is they do rough her up. And what do you think happens? Like, she ends up being right. If you guys, what they say, fuck around and find out, there's like 8 people who know that I'm in this location. You touch me, you're going to spend probably 10 years in jail. Go fuck yourself. Like, she has that edge to her. And it was perfect casting. And, Tony Todd was a stage performer, and his film debut was Oliver Stone's Platoon, where if you didn't know he was in it, you might, hey, that looks a little bit like, the guy that plays Candyman. But I didn't know that he was in Platoon. I had seen Platoon a couple of times, and I didn't even know that Tony Todd was in that movie. And then here I was at NYU Film School in American film 1975 to 1990. We're watching Platoon, and I forgot that Johnny Depp was in that movie. He plays the translator. And then there were a bunch of guys goofing around, John C. McGinley. And I said, wait a minute, that's Tony Todd. Completely forgot that he was in that movie. But his performance, he's got a great voice. I should say he had a great voice. And they used his voice to unbelievable effect the way that, yes, he's at first threatening to kill Helen, but he's almost like he's trying to seduce her. A vengeful spirit is almost acting like, a spurned lover. Even though the biggest problem for Daniel Robitaille is that he wasn't spurned in the 19th century, because if the girl had told him to take a flying leap, he probably wouldn't have had what happened to him happen. So before I forget, Candyman is it's streaming on Amazon Prime. So if you have Amazon, you don't have to pay $2 or $3 or whatever it is. And it's also on MGM Plus if you happen to not have Amazon, but you have MGM Plus. So it is streaming free on those services. If you've seen the 2021, because that's when it was released, all that nonsense about Helen Lyle and all that shit, it doesn't mean anything to you. So I would suggest that you go back and watch the original and see what all the fuss is about. But something that I bring up a lot, when you have an older movie, as the original Candyman is now 33 years old, you look on YouTube and you see movie reactors seeing certain films that my generation and older consider classic and seeing it for the first time. And almost all of the movie reactors, like the kind of top end people, whether it's Popcorn in Bed or Cinebinge or Asian BJ or TBR Schmidt, those kinds of channels where they have, sometimes over 1 million people watching them watch movies. And, you kind of watch along and it's fun if it's, you always want people to love the movies that you love. But most of the movie reactors who have seen Candyman, they say stuff like, I can't believe I didn't know about this movie. I love horror. Why didn't anybody ever tell me to watch this movie? Well, I got to watch it with you, that kind of thing. But it is a great horror film. And if I'm asked, what are some of the best book adaptations or, material that had been previously published turned into movies? Bridges of Madison County movie is way better than the book. Candyman. Clive Barker's short story is not that interesting. I don't know what Bernard Rose saw, but the framework for Candyman somehow dropped into his head when he read Clive Barker's The Forbidden sometime in the late 1980s. And that's really it. This is a top 5 all-time horror film as far as I'm concerned. And for a story that's as brutal as it is, surprisingly rewatchable. Because I got to tell you, I don't think I'm ever going to watch Get Out again. I have no interest in ever seeing Silence of the Lambs again. And the slasher films they don't really work for me. I'm not going to watch any Halloween movies going forward. I'm not interested. And I'm not into the torture porn of the Saw series, the Hostel series, or even the Final Destination series, which many people say a lot of the films are of, reasonable quality. But 33 years ago today, the world was introduced to a very tragic figure of Daniel Robitaille in Bernard Rose's sensational adaptation of Clive Barker's The Forbidden Candyman. This has been episode 630 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all so much for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Until then, peace.